President Joe Biden and his allies in the online and mainstream legacy media attempted today to completely rewrite history right in front of everybody's eyes, and virtually nobody has said one word about it. Now, I'm sure many of you might not be aware that earlier today, President Joe Biden gave a speech on the state of the economy, as if we would need a speech on that, right? Well, guess what? In that speech, he literally talked about how great MAGA is, while also saying how bad MAGA is. Now, what does MAGA stand for? Make America Great Again. The entire speech railed about how we need to become this manufacturing power again like we used to be in the good old days. But he said something about when he was a kid that was completely false, patently false, provably false, and not a single word from anybody. This is what happens when people get caught up in their emotions and they don't listen for context. Now, as I had promised for the last week or so, there is a brand new video out at the Florida Maquis Patreon channel where we talk about something that's going to shock a lot of people. There is a single key to surviving what's coming. And if you apply it across the board, it will work in every single situation, no matter what you face. There's a lot of folks that are going to willingly burn. Because why? Because it feels good and it's all they know. Now, the key can be found, ironically, in building a simple campfire. And we go through this, about a 25-minute video. If you'd like to be read in on this, join us over at Patreon. It's only $1 per month, even less if you sign up for an entire year. And most importantly, fully refundable first 90 days. You have nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. There's well over 100 videos over there. Gloves off. We can partner with Vimeo. We don't have to worry about censors. And we can talk about the truth. And it kind of dovetails with today's video a little bit. I was absolutely stunned after completing that video to hear what President Joe Biden had to say today, because it's so easy to knock out of the park if you divorce yourself from your emotions. But anyway, would love to have you at Patreon, lowest allowable level. Thank you, everyone who's joined us over there, and thank you for joining us here today. Now, President Joe Biden on the U.S. economy is trying to now rewrite history from about 100 years ago, maybe a little less. Now, we're going to roll the tape. This is the 6 minute and 22 second mark of the speech. It's actually, there's about a 2-minute lead in, so this is probably about 4:22, but on this particular clip, it's the 6:22 mark. We're going to listen to him talk about when he was young, sitting around his family's dinner table and his dad talking. Now, the key is knowing how old Joe Biden is and what was going on during during those years in the country. Let's listen to his words.
Well, growing up, I didn't see a whole hell of a lot trickle down on our 3-bedroom house with 4 kids and my dad's kitchen table. You know what? Trickle down didn't work for us. And it didn't work for a long time. And by the way, it's not just what's been in the MAGA Republicans. For the last 3-4 decades, we've been losing ground. And, you know, and it's hollowed out the middle class.
Okay, so let's be clear. Last 3-4 decades, we've been losing ground. So that would take us all the way back to the early 80s. So now he's dismissing what happened when Reagan took over and everything that happened in the Clinton years. We've been losing ground. But pay attention. Sitting around my table as a kid, Biden was born in 1942. So you're looking at probably what he's referencing is the post-war years. Now, I'm sure a lot of you that understand your history know how laughable this is. We're going to zoom this in. History of the United States, 1945 to 1964. This is right after the war. And let's read from liberal-controlled Wikipedia on the domestic front. After a short transition, the economy grew rapidly, with widespread prosperity, rising wages, and the movement of most of the remaining farmers to towns and cities. Politically, the era was dominated by liberal Democrats who held together with the New Deal coalition. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. Now, the years he's talking about, remember, he was born in 42. So let's assume he's talking about 49, 50, 51, going up to, into the early 60s. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a moderate who did not attempt to reverse New Deal programs such as regulation of business and support for labor unions. He expanded Social Security and built the interstate highway system, all very liberal socialist things. For most of the period, the Democrats controlled Congress. However, they were usually unable to pass as much liberal legislation as they had hoped because of the power of the conservative coalition. The Liberal coalition took control of Congress after Kennedy's assassination in 1963. Now, go look at what happened to society in general after 1963 in this country. Oh, but it gets better. Now, in this wiki, they go all the way down here. You go down to economy, or society, pardon me. Let's see if we can get this right here. Okay. At the center of the middle-class culture in the 1950s was a growing demand for consumer goods, a result of the post-war prosperity, the increase in variety of availability of consumer products, and television advertising. America generated a steadily growing demand for better automobiles, clothing, appliances, family vacations, and higher education. Now pay attention. Here are the years. Remember, Biden was born in 42. So in the years that he was 3 to 5 years old, after the initial hurdles of the 45 to 48 period were overcome, Americans found themselves flush with cash from wartime work due to there being little to buy for several years. The result was a mass consumer spending spree with a huge and voracious demand for new homes, cars, and housewares. Now, larger wages, larger houses, better schools. But Florida Maquis, this had a lot to do with the war. What are they trying to rewrite? Let's go down here to economy. Following the Republican takeover of Congress in the 1946 elections, when Joe Biden was 4, President Truman was compelled to reduce taxes and curb government interference in the economy. With this done, now pay attention here, the stage was set for the economic boom that, with only a few minor hiccups, would last for the next 23 years. Between 1945 and 1960, GNP grew by 250%, expenditures on new construction multiplied 9 times, and consumption on personal services increased 3 times. By 1960, per capita income was 35% higher than in 1945, when Eisenhower left office, liberal Democrat policies, and America had entered what the economist Walt Rostow referred to as the high mass consumption stage of economic development. Short-term credit went up from $8.4 billion in 1946 to $45.6 billion in 1958. As a result of the post-war economic boom, 60% of the American population had attained a middle-class standard of living by the mid-1950s. Now, at that time, that was income between $3,000 and $10,000 a year, compared with only 31% in the last year of prosperity before the onset of the Great Depression. By the end of the decade, 87% of families owned a TV set, 75% owned a car, and 75% owned a washing machine. Between 1947 and 1960, when Joe Biden is talking about, trickle-down economics didn't work for us. It didn't work for us, boy. I tell you what, it was terrible those years. In those years, the average real income for American workers increased by as much as it had in the previous 50. It just went on. And then the baby boom, public school systems. I mean, everything that happened in post-war in this, there was no world he could have possibly been living in that was suffering under the weight of trickle-down economics, which really didn't even come into vernacular at that time. Trickle-down economics didn't come around until Reagan, but according to his own words, we've been going backwards for the last 30 to 40 years. Let's do math. It's 2023. Let's go back 40 years. What would that be? 1983? So he's saying we've been going backwards since 1983? Since Reagan took over, and counting all of the Clinton years and counting all of the Obama years, that we've been going backward. Really? Well, given that we had Clinton for 8 years and Obama for 8 years, that's 16 of those years, and him for 3, so that's 19. That you guys have been in charge for half that time. Seriously. He's literally saying the era of the baby boom was a terrible time to be alive. Oh, things were terrible. Oh, trickle-down economics. Oh, people were suffering. I mean, that would have been the era when he would have been sitting around his father's table. What is he talking about? When is he talking about? If he's talking about the 60s, oh, please, let him be talking about the 60s. Because that's, a whole nother... But he wasn't sitting around his father's table in the 60s. He was 20-something years old and off to college by that time. And this is the wildest part about all this. When Reagan cut taxes back in the 80s, when he took over after Carter, we had this huge economic explosion in this country because he dropped the top marginal rate from 75% down into the 40s. Now, what did that do? There were a lot of very wealthy people that had taken their money and put it into real estate. Why? Because it was a tax haven. In order to avoid that 75% maximum rate, they took the money that they had and they invested it. Now, the government said this is a strategy. So when Reagan pulled that back, a huge amount of American money left American real estate. Guess who was not too all fired up excited in the 1980s about real estate numbers crashing? Mr. MAGA himself. That's right. In fact, there's video out there of Donald Trump speaking before Congress, railing against Ronald Reagan's tax cuts. Why? Because Donald Trump was a big real estate guy in Manhattan, and he had all sorts of money tied up in this. And when he dropped those tax rates, there was a huge flight of capital out of real estate because it was no longer a tax haven. Because the tax rate had dropped. And they could find other things to do with their money. This is absolutely insane. So Biden is literally saying, make America great again by standing against MAGA Republicans. He's literally saying, make America great again by standing against Make America Great Again Republicans. It's the most bizarre time to be alive I cannot imagine. If you would have said this to somebody 20, 25, 30 years ago, they would have called you patently insane. That you would have a guy, because remember, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, Biden was a super conservative Democrat. He was part of the Blue Dog Coalition. In fact, he was farther to the right than a lot of Republicans were at that time. Now, modern rules throw all that out the door. But nobody has said a word about this, that Biden just called the 50s in America a time where we were suffering under trickle-down. When it was the time of the greatest financial expansion this country's ever known. Seriously. I don't know if they're not teaching history anymore, or if people just don't know, or they don't even know what the term boomer means. Does Gen X or not Gen X, but Gen Z and millennials, do they even know what boomer means? Baby boom. Why were people having a bunch of babies? Because they had a whole bunch of extra money. And why did they have a whole bunch of extra money? It says it. You can look it up. It's literally in the wiki. It's literally in the... As noted by historian Nancy Weirick, in the post-war period, the majority of Americans were affluent in the sense that they were in a position to spend money on many things they wanted, desired, or chose to have, rather than on necessities alone. By the mid-1960s, the majority of Americans organized working class who were not victims of the Second Red Scare embraced, or at least tolerated anti-communism, because it was an integral part of the new American dream to which they had committed their lives. Theirs was not an unobtainable dream, nor were their lives empty because of it. Indeed, for at least a quarter of a century, the material promises of consumer-oriented Americanism were fulfilled in improvements in everyday life that made them the most affluent working class in American history. Let me say that again. They were the most affluent working class in American history. The middle class had maids. The middle class had enough money to have so many kids that they needed maids and they could afford the maids. And why? 1946, I'll say it again. Following the Republican takeover of Congress in the 1946 elections, President Truman was compelled to reduce taxes and curb government interference in the economy. Period. I mean, it's absolutely the live-in maid, and they have it right here, the live-in maid and cook, common features of middle-class homes at the beginning of the century, were virtually unheard of in the 1950s. Only the very rich had servants. Householders enjoyed centrally heated homes with running hot water. New-style furniture was bright, cheap, and light, and easy to move around. This isn't a little bit of history. This is a huge portion of history that they are trying to make a bunch of ignorant people believe didn't happen. It's just nuts. And he's sitting here talking to union workers at an IBEW in I should have looked at this to see where he was. I think it's Maryland or Delaware, somewhere. But point being, it's just phenomenal that nobody picks this up. Because you have one side that just wants to worship and adore the man, and you have the other side that wants to absolutely loathe him. But what's happening with both of them? What's happening with both of them? It's kind of what we talk about over at Patreon. They are so burning, so much burning with their emotions, either good or bad, they cannot stop. They cannot stop and breathe and listen and hear these things and understand them. It goes in one ear and out the other. And that's kind of where, we do this analogy with a fire that I think a lot of people would want to hear. So anyway, I will let you guys go. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Please join us over at Patreon. It's only a single US dollar per month. That's it. And like I said, after 3 months, if it's not for you, if the imagery is too much, you get them all back. You get them all back first 90 days. So anyway, God bless. Have a great rest of the couple days here. And like, share, subscribe. We'll see you guys next time.